We're looking for 0 chili peppers today, so I guess it would be below this bottom one. Look, I like my chili peppers in food, but not books. Hi, I'm Steph, and I love to chit-chat about otherworldly stories. Here's the thing though, I don't like romance, and romantasy has gotten more and more popular as of late, which is awesome. Great for those readers. I'm so happy for you. Really, truly, I hope you're getting a lot of joy out of those books. But it takes everything in me to not just skip past a sex scene. Oh, and to be clear, fuck those like purity culture people. Enjoy your smut, make books smuttier, and all that stuff. I'm just personally deeply disinterested in it. Also, keep pregnancy and body horror where it belongs. But I know a ton of romance readers who actually hate pregnancy storylines as well, so we might be aligned there. It's so scary. Anyway, today I've compiled a list of sci-fi and fantasy book recs for you that have minimal romance. It's honestly kind of tricky to find books within these genres where romance isn't mentioned at all, though some of these recs are completely romance-free. But what's true about all of these recs is that romance isn't central to the plot, and if it is present, it takes up a very minimal part of the book. Okay, let's get into it. The main character of The Teller of Small Fortunes is never explicitly stated to be on the Arrow-Ace spectrum, but she totally is. She 100% is. At least in my head and heart, she is. When I picked up this book, I honestly didn't expect to fall in love with it the way that I did. I'm not so much of a cozy fantasy person, like I'll jokingly say that I'm more of a chaos fantasy person. I love it when things are just going wrong all of the time, when people are constantly in fight or flight, there are bad things happening every which way. I eat that up. But I love this book so much because it strikes that balance between joy and whimsy and adventure, but also complexity and darkness. And I think that's just what cozy fantasy doesn't typically do for me. Like, I need there to be some stakes. And I can't really read stories that are set in what's supposed to be a utopia unless it's explicitly critiquing the utopia, because all I can think about are all of the people that would be erased. Anyway, this story is not a utopia, but it does have a sort of playful Dungeons and Dragons vibe. There's straight up acknowledgement of that in the text, which is really fun. Our main character is Tao, and we're following her along as she tells small fortunes. She can actually tell big fortunes too, like she has this greater sight, but she's keeping it low profile. There's this guild that are filled with mages, and they're on her tail, and she doesn't want to attract their attention for a lot of reasons, so she's just trying to tell these very mundane fortunes. She bops around from town to town with her good old trusty mule, and she doles out fortunes over things like tea leaves. And even though she grew up in this land where the story is taking place, she was born in another land called Shin, and so people constantly view her as a foreigner. And every time she meets someone new, and she meets a new group of people in a new town, she deals with all of these very aggressive and pointed questions, and ultimately she feels really alone. But then her world shifts when she stumbles across the people who become her adventuring party. There's this former soldier who's looking for his lost child. He doesn't know exactly what's happened to her, so he's searching the land looking for any clues and trying to bring her home. And then there's a reformed thief. He's definitely not reformed, but he claims he's totally 100% reformed. And then she meets this baker who's grown up in this small town, and she has all these great ideas for pastries, but nobody in her small town really gets her or understands her, and she's never left. So she gets this taste for adventure, and then she joins the party. And finally, there's a very charming, very hungry cat. I love any story that has an animal companion, so I loved the grumpy cat. So they go off together in search of this little girl, but everyone has secrets, especially Tao. She keeps a lot of things close to her chest. But as we all know, things never stay hidden forever. Like I mentioned earlier, Tao is kind of sitting between two identities, so she doesn't have a lot of memories of her homeland, and she's completely lost her first language too, but then everyone she meets views her as an other and different and like nefarious. Maybe she has bad reasons for being here. Most people have actually never met someone from Shin. And there's also a lot of underlying tensions because there's this potential war that's brewing. Anyway, Tao really feels like she has a foot in two worlds. There were a bunch of complicated moments during her upbringing. She tells us a bit about them. We get some flashbacks, and she just feels such a loss for her home and her culture, even though she really never had access to it in the first place. There are so many heart-wrenching scenes where she comes face to face with her identity, and to be clear, they're not all like sad, devastating scenes. There's a lot of kindness and strength here too. You can definitely tell a lot of these moments were plucked from the author's own experience, so even though we're in this fantasy world, it's super relatable. I enjoyed every single character here. I think they all had very compelling arcs, and they were all very different. There's so much theming around trust and forgiveness and companionship. Tao is just used to being completely on her own at this point, except for her mule, of course, so she doesn't even know how to start to let people in and how to make friends. But they all learn a ton from each other, and they all start letting each other in, and there's this really beautiful found family that's formed. Together, they start to figure out how they could heal old wounds and maybe even forgive. It's just such a great blend of sweetness and tears. The world is really creative too, and even though at times it does feel like more of a classic Dungeons and Dragons story, there are twists to every single magical creature that we encounter. The story overall moves relatively slowly, but we get all of these little mini arcs, like mini quests. You can imagine it like each one is a night of gameplay, and those kept me hooked. There's a lot of talk of fate and destiny versus choice, and like I mentioned, an awesome found family, and just the joys of finding friends who see you and get you and take the time to know you and just understand you. That's the true fantasy, am I right? It leans into how important it it is to trust yourself and be true to yourself, and be true to your own desires. It was just so awesome. P. Djèlí Clark novellas are just like peanut butter and jelly, because I don't know how he does it, but he creates these very full and rich, fleshed out worlds in such a small number of pages. Seriously, I've read 3 of his novellas now, and they were all spectacular. So let's talk about the Dead Cattail Assassins, and as you might have guessed, this is a book about assassins. It is not, however, about cats, and they're not like humanoid cats either. They don't have tails, sorry if that's disappointing to hear. But I promise you will not be disappointed with this novella. So our main character is Evine, and she serves the matron of assassins. Evine and everyone else who's part of the guild has had their memory wiped, and they've been resurrected, brought back from the dead. She's got these 3 unbreakable vows that she agreed to when she was resurrected, and she's got these contracts to fulfill, but other than that, she's living her best undead life. She's a little sneaky, but she's never had any trouble following through and completing contracts until this latest one messes her up. Because her current mark sparks a memory, and that's not even supposed to be able to happen. So now she's got to decide whether to ignore it and do her job and kill this person like she's supposed to do, or maybe start to unravel her past self. She doesn't know if she should risk absolutely everything to untangle her memories and let this target live. Like, she doesn't even know what she's missing. So the stakes are pretty darn high. The city and the setting, it's called Talabisi. It just totally came to life on these pages. It takes place during this pretty short time frame, and it's during this huge festival week in the city. We follow Evine, but we also see a mix of humans and magic and gods. I felt very, very grounded within these streets, and we get the chance to weave through like the luxury and the celebrations and the culture. There's a lot of glamour around this festival, but of course we're also following an assassin. So we see what lurks behind every corner in the deep dark undergrounds, because Evine just knows every part of the city. There's also a lot of interesting lore here. We get some interesting legends, and there are some unique class structures. There are things that feel very close to our reality and things that feel very far apart. But what's so incredible is that, like I mentioned, this is a novella, and I felt like we got more organic world building and richness within these like 200 pages than I've gotten from some fantasy books that are over 500 pages. He also sneaks in some immersive descriptions of the food and the clothing. It's all so rich. And the characters are a hoot too. It is a dark story, but Evine is very snarky and sassy. She's a little bit immature in a fun way. She brings a lot of levity to the more disturbing plot points. She's funny and she's charming, and I found her very easy to root for. We don't get to know any of the supporting characters that well, but they were all pretty interesting too. Friends and foes and gods and fellow assassins and magicians. Truly, I could not put this one down. I read it in one sitting. Like I mentioned, there are some heavier themes like oppressive power structures and the abuse of marginalized bodies, but you don't feel devastated after reading this book because the narration is such a delight, and there's a lot of playfulness that's woven into the text. Plus, it's a good old-fashioned revenge story, and you have a lot of fun with that, so you're not just dropped into darkness and grimness and despair. The pacing is a little bit awkward, and there was some repetition, which always bugs me in novellas because every single word counts here. But I also read an advanced reader copy, so it's possible that some of that was adjusted. I really hope you give this one a go. Next up is The Deep Sky, and I actually just reread this one for book club. It's our January pick. Honestly, every time I reread a book, especially if it's in community, I always get a little bit nervous because I'm like, what if I actually missed everything about this book and it is terrible? But that's never been the case, and for this one and for a lot of others, I've gotten much more out of it on a reread. Plus, it's prompted some really rich discussions in the Discord, and like I mentioned, it's our current book, so only a handful of people have finished it so far. I'm really looking forward to see what everyone else gets in there and says. But yeah, so many reactions and questions and ponderings. So we're following this spaceship called the Phoenix, which is heading towards this new planet called Planet X. On the spaceship are 80 young graduates of this elite academy called Evenstar. It was created by this tech billionaire, and it's meant to be humanity's last hope. Earth has been absolutely devastated by climate disasters and wars. A lot of places are underwater, unlivable, animals are extinct, tons of people are refugees, and there's just not enough space for them to live. You get the idea. Anyway, this whole crew has been trained really well since they were 12 years old, since they were kids, and they're meant to navigate to this new planet and deal with anything that comes their way in the meantime, and then land and terraform it and colonize it and start a whole new population. Except then someone sets off a lethal bomb and the ship is knocked off course. And just as importantly as getting their navigation back on track is that they have no idea who they can trust and who the imposter is. Our main character is Asuka, and she is the ship's alternate, so she kind of handles all the odd jobs and the odds and ends, and she takes on this investigation. But they're running out of time and tensions are unbelievably high. And while we're in this high-stakes environment, we also get flashbacks to Asuka's childhood and her time training at the academy. She had this very strained relationship with her family, there's a lot of trauma, and so when she eventually leaves Earth, she's actually not even on speaking terms with her mom, who's become a bit of an environmental extremist. There's this really fascinating chain of circumstances that lead up to Asuka securing her spot on the ship. There were different numbers of spots for different countries and some wild cards as well, but Asuka ends up representing Japan. She was mostly raised in the US, she doesn't have a strong connection to Japan, so she has a lot of doubts. She feels a lot of anxiety about her ability to truly claim Japan. And And on top of that, she has a lot of doubt about herself just as a worthy crew member and if her abilities are up to par. She's very loyal and honest and humble and hardworking versus a lot of her coworkers are not as much. It's awkward because these people were once her fierce competition and now they're her crewmates, and so she's used to seeing them very puffed up and elite and like the best of the best. She's also grappling with some survivor's guilt about the bombing and then all this mess with her family back home. Basically, she's totally ignoring it. She's not even opening any of the digital letters she's receiving from her mom, but there's a war that's brewing. The world building here I think is really interesting. You've got this complicated and advanced technology called DAR. Basically, all of the crew members have their own virtual realities and everything they see on the ship is reskinned to fit their reality. So they don't even know what the ship actually looks like, and they like reskin each other in different outfits as well, and people can modify their bodies in the virtual reality space. And that's another challenge to Asuka, who has to see through all of these layers and get to the truth. Asuka's also obsessed with birds, and growing up she collected these things called real birds. She wanted to watch their behavior because they were basically extinct on Earth. There's a lot of interesting bird tidbits here. You learn a lot of facts about birds and also bird symbolism. So much bird imagery. I was into it. There's also a lot of reflections about Earth and funding and nationalism and radicalization and thinking about billionaires who are playing around in space while cities burn. Totally not relatable to us at all right now. Also, there's an AI who runs their virtual reality and sort of controls the ship and acts a bit like their babysitter, like making sure they're all up to date on their shifts and telling them to rest and to eat and when they need to go to therapy. Honestly, there's so much to chew on here, so much to philosophize about, way beyond the pages of the book and its central themes and its central mystery. The crewmates are an intriguing group, and even though we don't get to meet even close to all 80 of them, the relationships that we do see are varied and complex, and there's a very diverse set of characters here. The ship only launches with those who are able to bear children, and that's sort of part of their crew expectation. They're supposed to have and raise at least one child while they're in space. So it's mostly a group of women with some non-binary and trans characters as well. They're all very, very fascinating. I loved the flashbacks. I ate up the flashbacks, but I actually wished we had been able to spend more time on the ship in the present because I wanted to get to know these characters a bit more. And because there are so many other things happening, the investigation portion does become a little obvious at times, like the red herrings are very clear, but the whole thing is very nuanced, and my level of interest in the culprit and in their motive was very high the entire time. There's darkness and fear, and there's scary moments, but I don't think this is meant to be a distressing book. There's quiet and cautious optimism here, and we get to watch the crew sort through these issues and get to lean on each other and trust each other and rebuild their family, even after that family has been devastated. And I don't know, at least from my perspective, watching this micro community learn how to grow and rebuild after this tragedy gives me a little bit of hope for our larger community of Earth. Alright, the Ballad of Perilous Graves is very confusing, okay? It's total chaos. Please do not come back here and yell at me and say that the book is very confusing, because I'm telling you straight up. It's super confusing, and that's part of the reason why I loved it so much. It's such an innovative and imaginative book, and the music plays such a big role, like lyricality too, that you just kind of have to lean in and embrace the rhythms of it. It's madness, it's a whirlwind, it's a delight. The book takes place in New Orleans, and it's really all about the soul of the city. There are multiple New Orleans, and they're layered on top of each other, but we're mostly existing in the fantastical version. And here, music is literal magic, and the city is full of all sorts of fascinating creatures and spirits. There are ghosts, and there are dead cabs, and there are sky trolleys, and all sorts of interesting wonders. There's this magical piano that helps keep the city on beat, except one night, these 9 songs escape, and they get on the loose. And suddenly, everything is going very, very, very wrong. The city is falling apart, and it's up to our main characters, who are kids, to save their home. 2 of them are slightly magical, and one is like this straight-up superhero child, and they go on this heroic journey, which very quickly becomes very dangerous. They're up against these huge magical evils, and they're tumbling back and forth across realities and worlds and space and time. And they realize that it really is up to them. Like, these adults that act like they know everything and that they're always in control are too scared to step up and save their city. It was such an interesting choice to make the narrators children because we get to see the music and the magic of the city through their eyes. To be clear, this is an adult book. The narrators are just kids. But as we know, children are sometimes more open to things and more aware of things than adults are. And this journey is very special when you see it from their perspective. There's a whole lot going on, like I mentioned earlier, so if you're someone who really needs linear storytelling, you are going to hate this. I'm so sorry. And the world building is not smooth. It is not gentle. You are just plopped right on this roller coaster ride. I know there are a lot of real references to New Orleans, and it's not a city that I personally know a lot about, so if you know more, if you've lived there, if you've been there a lot, if you have those connections, you're definitely going to pick up on more of those references and those winks and those nods. I'm sure that I personally missed a lot. You definitely don't have to know New Orleans to enjoy this book because, like I mentioned, I don't know it at all and I loved this. There are a lot of different narrators and timelines and worlds, but I will say this writing is really good at distinguishing narrative voices. They're so specific. So I never doubted who was speaking, even when we switched within a single chapter. There are tons of twists, but also a lot of things that are left unanswered. Honestly, this is the sort of book that I really think deserves a reread. I haven't had a chance to reread it myself yet, but I just think there's so much more that you'd pick up on the second time that you read it. But yeah, it's funny, it's deep, it's creative, it's a wild ride. It's really unlike practically anything else I've ever read. So if you're looking for a very fresh voice in the fantasy realm, I recommend this one for sure. And last but not least, Elatsoe. Elatsoe is the only young adult book on this recommendations list, and it 100% does sit in that young adult space with those young adult emotions. So while I truly believe it's a worthwhile read, if you're just not into being in that young adult space, this may be a pass for you. This is a paranormal fantasy mystery, and it takes place in a slightly altered, magical version of America. So magic is real, monsters and mythical creatures are real, there are fairy rings and people that can conjure orbs of light and legends and so on. Our main character is Elatsoe. She goes by Ellie. She's a Lippian-Apache teenager and she can raise the ghosts of dead animals, which is a power that has been passed down through generations of her family. But then Ellie's cousin is murdered in this very strange and secluded town called Willoughby. Everything is picture perfect in Willoughby on the outside, but they hate visitors. They do not want any prying eyes. They don't want anyone to see what's really going on behind their masks. But don't worry, Ellie is determined to uncover the truth and get justice for her cousin, and she's going to use her powers to do it. This broke some of the more standard young adult molds in really charming ways. For example, Ellie has 2 living parents, and they love Ellie, and they respect Ellie, and they listen to her, and she has a good relationship with them. Of course, ultimately, she is a teenager, and so she doesn't always want to listen to them or to take their advice, but her parents are good people, and she has strong relationships with them, and I just found that really refreshing to read about. Ellie is also asexual, and she has a guy best friend, and there's no weirdness about that at all. Like, no other people in her life saying, oh, you guys should get together, and no weird romantic drama, nothing like that. They're just BFFs, and everyone is 100% supportive of their friendship. As someone who loves animal companions, I think I've already mentioned that once in this video. Anyway, as someone who loves animal companions, Ellie's power to raise the ghosts of dead animals was so fun to read about. There are some ghostly dog sidekicks who help her throughout this mystery, and I loved reading about them. There also may or may not be ghost dinosaurs. Hearing that pitched to me was one of the reasons I first picked up this book, so I'm spreading the good lore. I liked that it was sort of a blended reality. So we get some unique lore, and there are a lot of different magical tropes and elements, but we also get to highlight real indigenous struggles. There's a lot of social commentary here, and it's very direct, it's very young reader friendly, but it does feel sprinkled and integrated organically into the story. Ellie is spunky and determined and actually feels like a teenager to me. Some reviewers felt like she reads a bit too young, but I felt like her reactions and the way she processed things and the way she made decisions read very realistically. And on the flip side, I think a lot of other young adult books tend to age teenagers up, so maybe we're all just used to that. Overall, it's a very fast-paced read with an interesting mystery at its core, and I thought the writing style was very charming. I also recommend Shayna Lende, which is a separate standalone story, but it serves as a prequel to Elatsoe, and it follows Elatsoe's grandmother. Darcie Little Badger is just such a naturally gifted storyteller, and I'm excited to pick up more from her. Okay, everyone, I hope that's enough to get you started. Horror is the other main genre that I read, so I could do a horror version of this, but I do feel like it's a lot easier to find horror books without romance, so maybe people don't need that as much. Anyway, be sure to subscribe and stick around for some more book recs. And info about my reading community and book club and all of that good stuff, all of that additional info is down below in the description. Thanks so much for being part of my community as I try my best to commit to more long form videos. I'm so excited to see how this channel is gonna grow. And I'm really grateful to everyone that has believed in me and stuck by me and supported me so far. So thanks again, everyone, and I'll see you next time.